Good evening, Goeienaand, Dumelang, Molweni. I am very pleased to welcome you all to this Vice-Chancellor's Open Lecture, which the University of Cape Town is delivering online. We have people from all around the world joining us this evening. I want to give a special acknowledgement to the UCT Chancellor, Dr. Precious Moloi-Motsepe, and our new Chair of Council, Ms. Baba Along-Gonyama, who are also joining us online. Thank you so much for making the time. In the audience, there are also other members of the UCT Council, former and current members of Parliament, members of the Diplomatic Corps, business leaders, vice-chancellors of other universities, as well as academics, dignitaries from a range of sectors in our country and abroad, staff and students of UCT, our generous donors and alumni, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to this, our first VC Open Lecture for 2020. COVID-19 makes it more imperative than ever before that we take every opportunity to connect with each other in any way we can. The Vice-Chancellor's Open Lecture was set up to provide an opportunity for anyone, whether they are connected to UCT or not, to have the benefit of hearing firsthand from people who have distinguished themselves in their respective areas of expertise, people who inspire us to greatness. An important part of my vision of UCT leadership is to instill a sense of inclusivity, transformation, and excellence within UCT community. By hosting this lecture online, we have the opportunity to include alumni and other friends of the UCT community across South Africa and the world while we adhere to the responsible practice of social distancing. COVID-19 is teaching us that we all have a part to play in helping to keep each other safe. Similarly, we are all affected by COVID-19's effects on the economy. To help us consider what our economic future might hold, I am proud to introduce you to Colin Coleman, who will speak on the topic from a two-speed economy to one for all South Africa. CA Today journalist Ed Sinclair defines the two-speed economy as one where one sector of industry or business grows at a much more rapid rate than another, often masking the slow rates of growth in the smaller sector. He points out that the world would be defined as a two-speed economy with growth in Western economies now being dwarfed by the emerging economies like Brazil, China, and India. In South Africa, we are all too familiar with the challenges of a two-speed economy that the two-speed economy brings. We need to examine economic alternatives that will help us defeat those challenges: unemployment, socio-economic exclusion, and food insecurity. Colin Coleman has warned us in media commentaries that COVID-19 has presented us with a stark dilemma, not only as a country, but as a continent. In his words, and I quote, "Either we grasp growth and help make it happen in Africa, or we face a human catastrophe for the whole world." Close quote. Colin's career in investment banking spans the world, but he has never lost his focus on South Africa, where he was born and raised. He was a partner of Goldman Sachs, one of the most influential companies in the world, and chief executive officer of its sub-Saharan Africa division until he retired at the end of last year. This year, he has taken up an appointment as a senior fellow and lecturer at Yale University's Jackson Institute for Global Affairs. Colin earned a bachelor's degree in architecture from the University of the Witwatersrand in 1988. He was an anti-apartheid activist and was deeply involved in South Africa's constitutional transition to democracy. He served in working groups of the multi-party talks, facilitated the International Mediation Forum, and helped negotiate the agreement to facilitate all parties' participation in South Africa's first democratic election in 1994. Colin's awards include being nominated as one of the World's Economic Forum's Global Leaders for Tomorrow, receiving Harvard Business School's Business Statement Award on behalf of the consultative business movement, and being named one of Euromoney's world top 10 financing leaders for the 21st century. He is a senior advisor to the Eurasia Group and an independent non-executive member of the board of the Foschini Group. He also serves on the steering committee of the CEO Initiative and is co-chairman of the Youth Employment Service, also known as YES. In opinion pieces published earlier this year, Colin refers to two possible fates for the African continent. We can become the last frontier for global growth, or alternatively, the source of global instability and extremism, accounting for 17% of the world's population, but only 3% of global gross domestic product. I met Colin Coleman at a conference in Johannesburg last year, mightily impressed by his talk. I introduced myself. We subsequently had one of the most memorable breakfast meetings in Cape Town, where we chatted about a broad range of topics, including his perspective on Africa. And I'm delighted tonight to welcome him now to this online platform so that the UCT community can hear Colin's personal and professional, economic and political outlook for South Africa. Colin, I hand over to you. We look forward to hearing from you.
Chancellor Dr. Moloi Motsepe, Vice-Chancellor Pakeng, thank you most kindly for that introduction. Chair of UCT Council, my friend Babalwa Ngonyama, members of the UCT Council, ministers, business leaders, and dignitaries present, faculty and students of the University of Cape Town, ladies and gentlemen on the webinar, greetings. It is indeed an honor and privilege for me to address you virtually today. My fellow compatriots, South Africa is in trouble. No society can survive 50% unemployment, yet including for those 7.1 million South Africans looking for employment but who cannot find it, those 2.9 million South Africans who have given up looking for work, and those estimated 1.5 million workers expected, unfortunately, to lose their jobs due to the COVID-19 pandemic in 2020, that is exactly what our expanded unemployment rate can be expected to be by the end of this year. Pre-COVID effects, with South Africa's economy already in recession, the expanded unemployment rate is already at a frightening 42%. No doubt, just this one aspect of our present reality represents an economic state of emergency for our beloved country. But there is more. Firstly, inequality has racial markings everywhere. For instance, 89% of those looking for jobs but unable to find them are African, whilst only 2.3% are white. Secondly, women and the youth are bearing the brunt. 43% of women versus 36% of men are unemployed, whilst for 25 to 34-year-olds, it is 47%. Thirdly, it is a shame that gender-based violence is tearing communities apart and driving fear into the hearts of all women, mothers, fathers, and children in this country. And lastly, South Africa is one of the most unequal societies in the world. Our Gini coefficient score remains the highest in the world at a stubborn 0.65, with over 30 million out of our nearly 60 million South Africans, or 51% as per the World Bank International Poverty Line definition of an income of less than $2 per day, who now live in poverty. This reality, my friends, compounded by the now surging COVID-19 pandemic, reflects South Africa's two-speed society. One part, modern, affluent, technologically advanced, skilled, mobile, dynamic, and increasingly non-racial. The other, jobless, marginalized, unskilled, young, mostly rural or peri-urban outcasts, largely African and increasingly restless, bereft of hope, and condemned, yes, to poverty. This is the ongoing structural legacy of apartheid and colonialism, which the democratic government is battling and frankly not yet succeeding to overcome. I propose here and elaborate in this talk on a 10-point action plan to forge one economy that works for all, as follows. Firstly, an intervention to put income in the hands of these unemployed and most vulnerable South Africans, thereby protecting livelihoods and stimulating consumption. 2, the introduction of tax reforms to fund this intervention in a fiscally neutral way, making the tax system work smarter and harder for those most in need. 3, a campaign to wage war on the rampant illegal economy in South Africa and confront tax evasion, fraud, criminality and corruption, and bring an end to the scourge of state capture. 4, re-engineering the COVID relief fiscal plan to provide much needed funding, either interest-free loans or equity into struggling but solid businesses. 5, supporting SMMEs to provide fuel to South Africa's largest job-creating machinery, driving a new generation of entrepreneurs. 6, unlocking infrastructure blockages through public-private partnerships that reduces input costs and expands productive capacity of businesses. 7, introducing an e-government initiative, this is my personal favorite, to transform and modernize the public service, making South Africa a capable country with a smart and capable state. 8, negotiating a comprehensive resolution of Eskom's capital structure and business model to eliminate South Africa's largest single fiscal and systemic risk and bring stability to the country's largest state-owned enterprise. 9, reviewing and redesigning South Africa's industrialization plan to create 5 million jobs over the next decade by creating economic incentives to drive competitiveness and position South Africa as a regional supply hub and gateway into Africa for global and local manufacturers. And lastly, an ambitious plan to end apartheid spatial planning and create integrated and densified urban centers close to work opportunities. This may take me back to my architecture days and get me out of banking altogether. Any economic plan, my friends, should aim to create a fast-growing and dynamic economy, facilitating a seamless, connected structure of opportunity and access for all, a kind of ladder up and down the economy, driven on merit, recognizing talent and rewarding hard work, irrespective of race, gender, and class, with a hand up for the historically disadvantaged. This is what the 10-point action plan aims to achieve. Let me turn to the economic backdrop. Given the dark COVID clouds over our economy today, it seems easy to forget that across important measures in the Mandela and Mbeki period from 1994 to 2007, South Africa made big strides forward. GDP growth rates averaged 3.6% per annum, with GDP doubling from $140 billion in 1994 to $285 billion in 2007. Inflation fell from double digits in the decade prior to 94 to an average in that period of 6.3%. Government's debt as a percentage of GDP fell remarkably to 28% in 2007, and the budget grew ninefold in the 2 decades from 94 to 2014. A highly effective and successful social grant system was established that now reaches 18.3 million South Africans. But around 2008, this steady progress was rudely interrupted by the double whammy of the global financial crisis and the ascension of President Zuma and his allies, whose central purpose it would turn out to be was a cynical project of state capture. This project saw a systematic repurposing of the state, its institutions and SOEs as a site of accumulation under the guise of a developmental state, a scourge we still battle to defeat today, and which effectively succeeded in hollowing out state institutions and crippling many SOEs. Consequently, from 2008 to 2019, South Africa's GDP growth rates more than halved to an average of 1.5%. But if you adjust for an economic contraction this year of 7.2%, as forecast by the National Treasury, and there are many believe that the contraction will be greater, the average growth rate since 2008 will now, somewhat shockingly, adjust to an average of under 1%, well below our 1.5% population growth rates. So, whilst GDP per capita almost doubled from $3,400 in 1994 to $6,600 in 2013, it fell back by 2019 to only $6,000 as South Africans get poorer. The overall size of our economy, in fact, peaked in 2011 with a GDP of $410 billion, but has declined by $220 billion since, practically to the size it was in 2007. In contrast, and I believe in looking at comparative emerging market examples, the Polish economy grew from $420 billion in 2007 to $592 billion today, with its GDP per capita now 2.5 times South Africa's. This absolute and relative decline in the size of the South African economy came at a terrible opportunity cost. The IMF in 2013 expected South Africa's economy would grow in keeping with global peers to a size of around 467 billion, as they published by the end of 2019, 6 years later. Only, in fact, for it to fall to the $290 billion mentioned earlier, a difference of 177 billion. So over 13 years, therefore, we recorded between 120 and 177 billion dollars in missing GDP, a midpoint cost in rand equivalent of a sickening 2.5 trillion rand, the true cost to South Africa of Zuma economics and state capture. With our economy now back at 2007 levels, but with 10 million more South Africans to feed, we instead face an economic picture that has weakened considerably. Today, overall government debt of 4 trillion rand represents 81.8% of debt to GDP. And absent reforms is set to be a runaway train, reaching 100% by 2023. Alas, had our GDP not shrunk by 2.5 trillion, our debt to GDP ratio today would instead be a healthy 54%. Although elevated, let us note that our debt to GDP levels are still lower, according to IMF 2020 forecasts, than the UK at 102%, USA at 141%, the European Union at 105%, and Japan at over 250%, respectively. However, in all cases, their interest rates and cost of borrowing are materially lower and their economy is much more resilient. As we consider our fiscal response, Jita Kopanath, the IMF's economist, warned last week, and I quote, "While the trajectory of public debt could drift up further in an adverse scenario, an earlier than warranted fiscal retrenchment presents an even greater risk of derailing the recovery with large future fiscal costs," close quote. Now, with the National Treasury expecting a tax revenue shortfall of 300 billion rand this year, the consolidated budget deficit is expected to reach 15.7% of GDP for the current fiscal year. Let's put it simply, the 640 billion public sector wage bill, plus the 236 billion interest cost of our national debt, plus the 190 billion cost of social grants this year, is equivalent to our entire forecast tax revenue of 1.1 trillion this year. The salary and interest bill thus crowds out fiscal space in our revised 1.8 trillion budget for essential government services and needs to be thoughtfully managed down. A fresh start indeed, as proposed by the Finance Minister, with zero-based budgeting, allows policymakers to look at everything with fresh eyes. Not as an excuse to arbitrarily cut budgets across the board, but to forensically reallocate less funding to some and more to others, depending on critical national priorities. Gopinath's advice is prescient for South Africa. Again, I quote her, countries will need sound fiscal frameworks for medium-term consolidation through cutting back on wasteful spending, widening the tax base, minimizing tax avoidance, and greater progressivity in taxation in some countries. Close quote. Somewhat counterintuitively, there is a marked improvement between 2001 and 2019, notwithstanding, as I described, deteriorating economic macro and micro indicators in the implied asset ownership by South African households across the board. Living standard measures, LSMs, record the ownership of a variety of household goods, property, consumer, and other assets. What one observes is a sharp decrease from 11.2 million South Africans in 2001 in lower LSM category to 2.4 million. In the middle bucket, LSM 4 to 6, more than doubles from 11.3 million South Africans in 2001 to 24.5 million in 2019. And equally, a doubling of the upper income LSMs, bucket 7 to 10, from 6.5 million in 2001 to 15.1 million in 2019. How do we explain this upward migration in LSMs when all other indicators are moving south? And what does this mean? Firstly, the informal, untaxed, and unrecorded economy in South Africa is large and active, including the 1.8 million informal SMMEs pre-COVID, who combined with 800,000 formal SMMEs jointly employ over 11.5 million South Africans. Bear in mind, when we say informal, we mean also that these businesses are not paying tax. Many are below the tax threshold, and they are not recording their activities and in a way that we can measure very accurately. Second, public sector above inflation wage growth has spurred asset accumulation for the 2.9 million public sector employees and their families. Third, social grants have cushioned the poor, but the supply of unsecured credit has fueled asset purchases on borrowings. And lastly, there is a large illegal economy, with the proceeds of state capture and corruption estimated by some to total as much as 1.5 trillion rand since 2008, fueling domestic ownership, asset ownership. President Zuma may have left the stage, but Zuma economics is not dead. For a variety of reasons, these drivers of accumulation have come or are coming to an end. We have reached the limits of personal and household borrowings. President Ramaphosa's administration is increasingly closing down the space for the state capture project. The state is now unable to pay above inflation public sector wage increases. GDP trend growth is below population growth, and the COVID pandemic is devastating jobs and incomes. Therefore, as we now face our economic growth, jobs, inclusion, and looming sovereign debt crisis in South Africa, bold new thinking and action is needed. Stale and obsolete ideas have no place. As Albert Einstein is believed to have remarked, the definition of insanity is doing the same thing over and over again and expecting a different result. To my fellow South Africans, we all need to get out of our comfort zones, purge ideological boundaries, and forego narrow interests, business included. To my business friends, we must have an honest conversation and ask the hard questions about how our conduct as business can drive inclusion, what this means for executive compensation, or the hard issues such as preventing monopolistic and cartel-like behavior, how to drive employment equity and empowerment, training and internships, reskilling and entrepreneurship, financing and mentorship for small business, and driving innovation. And then, having had these hard conversations with ourselves, we can ask the same of our government, of unions, of civil society counterparts, to take a hard look at what you need to change. Let's solve problems together, and let's talk as one team South Africa. Yes, fellow South Africans, we must do whatever it takes, however uncomfortable, to get our economy back on the path of recovery, to protect the vulnerable and grow one economy for all. So I propose a 10-point plan to build one economy for all, to collect as much tax revenue as our economy can digest, to make every cent of our expenditures count, to take people out of starvation and hunger, to wage a war on corrupt, wasteful and irregular expenditure, to get bang for our buck from education and health expenditure, to provide jobs and opportunities, and to be ruthless in prioritizing our spending in the interests of economic justice for all South Africans. This is an economy that should do three things. One, shield the poor from poverty. Two, grow at a 5% per annum long-term rate, and add 5 million jobs by the year 2030. As co-chairman of the Youth Employment Service, YES, which is doing very important work to place unemployed youth into businesses as paid interns, numbering now over 36,000 to date, and watching the fantastic work being done by civil society groups such as Harambee and A.D. Enthoven, the chairman is online and we welcome him, or the government's presidential youth employment intervention led by Donna Nicol and Rudy Dix in the presidency. I can see the value of these, but also the limits of current approaches. And I'm therefore convinced, a view I believe is now widely shared, including by government, that as this pandemic exposes the traumatic fault lines in our society, South Africans aged 15 to 29 permanently without a job, not receiving any form of social grant or unemployment benefit, such as the UIF or any other form of state assistance, must receive government support. It is essential as an emergency measure to provide a universal and comprehensive solution in the form of targeted basic income support. I have concluded that it is indeed time for South Africa to introduce, in a fiscally neutral manner that I will demonstrate shortly, some form of basic income grant. For social stability, inclusion, and in service of our constitutional obligations that, quote, affirms human dignity, equality, and freedom, unquote, the role of a big today must be to tear down the walls of economic exclusion and social indignity. As Martin Luther King said in May 1967, it's all right to tell a man to lift himself by his own bootstraps, but it is a cruel jest to say to a bootless man that he ought to lift himself by his own bootstraps. It is even worse to tell a man to lift himself by his own bootstraps when somebody is standing on the boot. South Africa, we have to take our feet off the boots and necks of the unemployed. Instead, it is now time to lend a compassionate helping hand with the introduction of a BIG. Applying the international poverty line benchmark of $2 per day, equivalent to around 1,080 Rand per month across 10.8 million people, this BIG would cost South Africa around 140 billion Rand per annum before annual inflation. My proposal, therefore, would be to introduce this BIG effective in October, when the temporary COVID 350 Rand grant terminates by targeting the 10.8 million unemployed South Africans. But alternatively, one could equally choose with the same pool of 140 billion Rand to target all 39 or 32 million adults with 365 Rand per month, with a clawback for those above an income limit, or all 23.5 million labour force participants with 500 Rand per month, also with such a clawback. The merits of these alternatives should be subjected to a rigorous review. The key criteria should be maximizing economic impact on poor households, simplicity and cost of administration, and speed and effectiveness of getting cash into the hands of the targeted beneficiaries. How can South Africa now pay for the big? You may well ask, given our fiscal situation. Given that the ceiling on our overall tax capacity as a percentage of our economy has been reached, I present a plan previewed with some of the country's leading tax experts that I thank for their engagement to re-engineer the application of existing tax revenues and allocations to make a big possible in a fiscally neutral manner as follows. As on your screen, I will go through where the tax revenue expenditure saving items are and what savings can be generated line by line. Firstly, one can eliminate the medical aid tax credit for the income bracket over 300,000 Rand per annum and generate 12.5 billion Rand. Second, one can increase the dividend withholding tax to 25% from a current 20%, generating 5 billion Rand. Third, cap interest deductions for corporates at 25% net debt to earnings before income tax, depreciation and amortization, and remove carry forward allowances on the debt, generating 10 billion Rand. Then we can replace estate duty with the progressive inheritance tax that would generate around 5 billion Rand without moving the brackets much. We then talk about removing the retirement fund deductions for those earning an income over 600,000 Rand, generating an income of 27 billion Rand, or savings of 27 billion Rand, from a total of 77 billion Rand being spent on these retirement fund deductions. I know this is a hot topic today, given the situation in COVID with alcohol and tobacco, but in a normalized year, one could increase sin taxes by 20% is my proposal, and thus create greater incentives for people not to smoke nor to drink, from 55 billion spent in 2019-20 tax year by another 11 billion. We could increase the carbon tax to 1/4 of the EU standard and generate 2 billion. By eliminating bracket creep relief over a 2-year period, one can generate in the first year 10 billion Rand. We can re-engineer the VAT system, both the credits and potentially the tiering, and upward adjust old age and child support grants to compensate and to ensure net gains for low-income households and generate 18.6 billion Rand. An interest saving on 325 billion of Eskom government guaranteed debt, which I will come to later, can generate 3.5 billion Rand by moving it onto the government's balance sheet and getting the credit spread benefit of so doing. If we were to trim the government by reducing cabinet size, departmental duplications, expenditures on conferences, travel, and overall government savings, as has been demonstrated can be done in COVID, we should be able to generate on the 70 billion Rand spent on general public services, about 5% of that, equivalent to 3.5 billion. And we are proposing here to introduce a 5% withholding tax on state procurement contracts, creditable against tax payable on the value of the contracts, which were 334 billion in the last year. And through charging effectively that 5% withholding tax upfront, you generate about 16.5 billion. It may be controversial, but I believe that it's important for all sectors of the economy to participate in the tax process. And so for the top 10% of the SMMEs who are not paying any form of tax or license fees, I'm proposing that we should consider introducing a license fee of 5,000 Rand per annum for businesses that have been going for more than 3 years, who are not registered for tax and who are not paying any other form of tax to the government. And that would generate a very small 1 billion, but it would start a process of bringing those people into the legal net of the tax system, which will provide the country benefits, but also give them protection. And lastly, by reducing departmental allocations or clawing back on irregular, wasteful expenditure, as last reported by the Auditor General, of around 94 billion Rand for all levels of government departments, and target a saving of only 15% of this wasteful expenditure, one can generate around 14 billion. The aggregate total of all of these tax reforms would total 140 billion, thereby facilitating the basic income grant in a fiscally neutral manner. My friends, these tax reforms do require sacrifices and pain, sharing across the board, tilted towards the wealthy and middle classes, who can best absorb such pain. But the benefits will be felt by the whole society, including the middle class and the wealthy. Such a big should not only be seen as an expenditure, it is in fact an investment and may represent the best form of short-term economic stimulus this country can now introduce, particularly in this COVID-19 crisis moment. As the recipients are likely to spend the grant on essential items such as food, clothing, and other essential household goods, we should see immediate benefits across the economy, including in VAT payments and increased corporate tax. This will be good for confidence, national unity, and solidarity, and enhancing for the economy and society as a whole. As Martin Luther King said in 1968, in proposing a guaranteed income for Americans, quote, open quote, if democracy is to have breadth of meaning, it is necessary to adjust this inequity. It is not only moral, but it is also intelligent, close quotes. The fact that today a 154 billion Rand big can be financed as shown in a fiscally neutral way demonstrates a false dichotomy present in our national discourse between rising fiscal constraints and meeting national needs. The two are not necessarily exclusive of each other. If minds are applied to the trade-offs required and smart choices are made based on national priorities. Hopefully, this one example serves as encouragement to all economic policymakers to explore the art of the possible and to get past that which divides us. These tax reforms should also spur focus on tax compliance and enforcement and encourage all South Africans to support SARS and the state enforcement agencies in clamping down on the rampant illegal and unrecorded economy. SARS is reportedly working with the Davis Tax Committee to wage a war on tax evasion and avoidance, targeting 100 billion Rand or more of non-compliance, aggressive tax planning, such as transfer pricing abuse, base erosion, and profit shifting, VAT fraud, corruption, and other avoidance or criminal schemes. This campaign deserves all our support. An increased focus on corruption and the elimination of the abuses highlighted by the Auditor General's reports on wasteful, irregular, and unauthorized expenditure, which he quantified at 94.6 billion for all levels of government, is urgently needed. As noted in my proposals, government departments cannot get off scot-free when wasteful, irregular, or unauthorized expenditures occur. They need either to penalize the culprits themselves or have the proportional funds removed from their budgetary allocations. It is now important, in the midst of the COVID pandemic, to rescue and protect households, but also the productive capacity of businesses. That should guide the ongoing COVID fiscal response and any adjustments to the President's announced 500 billion rand package. The proposed BIG will significantly assist households, but for rescuing troubled but normally solid businesses, immediate consideration could be given to two things. One, reimagining the remaining as yet unallocated 100 billion rand of the loan guarantee scheme in the form of interest-free loans via participating banks, subsidized by the South African Reserve Bank, the PIC and/or UIF, probably at a net cost of around 8% of the loan amount. Or not unlike the Troubled Asset Relief Program, TOP, of the United States post the global financial crisis, this 100 billion could be alternatively structured as an equity or hybrid equity investment by government, together with the IDC and/or PIC in struggling but still promising businesses. So businesses would either get interest-free loans or grants that can help them on their way. The second adjustment to the support for businesses we are waiting on in the negotiations between the banks, the South African Reserve Bank, and the government with respect to the current 100 billion rand scheme. And it is obvious that in order to fast track the success of that scheme, one needs to lift the thresholds that have been imposed at 300 million rand, lift the turnover requirement, and take away some of the requirements that have been imposed to allow for easier credit provision by the banks. Turning to an economic growth plan for the country. More than anything, we need now to change course to get economic growth back on track towards our post-94 average 2.6% growth rate in the short term and 5% in the medium and longer term. But how, my friends, do we achieve this? Well, government, business, and civil society obviously need to work collaboratively in a climate of teamwork to find common purpose. Business is the driver of growth, not the enemy. As pointed out by the umbrella body, Business for South Africa, business generates 83% of the country's GDP, 55% of the taxes, 79% of the jobs, and 69% of investments in South Africa. Government in particular has to therefore remove obstacles to private sector participation and investment and facilitate private sector partnerships and build investor and consumer confidence. Last week, both the Business for South Africa and the governing ANC both released economic policy documents. There is much common ground and some important differences. Yet, underneath, the chains of vested interests and ideology seem to weigh the debate down and prevent both sides from breaking fresh ground. We have two overriding challenges. First, private sector confidence to invest, and second, a state with a cripplingly weak institutional and implementation capacity. Our goal, not a big state, not a small state, but a smart state that works. Not big business, not small business, but patriotic business that invests. Both business and the ANC propose long lists of things to be done, but we only have the capacity as a nation to focus on a few things at a time and select those with the highest potential impact and with the greatest multiplier effect that can be quickly implemented. So as part of the 10-point plan to build an inclusive economy, I have boiled these down to 6 key initiatives. Firstly, SMMEs. We need to target the ease of doing business, in particular, removing obstacles in the way of SMMEs. A pact to buy local, to build local, and employ local, not to the exclusion of others, must be the language of business diplomacy today. And the pact should include supporting Black entrepreneurs, providing essential business infrastructure, technology, and subsidized free internet support, paying SMMEs on time. In return, SMMEs must pay their fair share of taxes and contract with the state in a fair, transparent, and above-board manner at all times. Second, unlocking a mix of standalone government infrastructure projects, things they can get on with without the private sector, and should be public-private partnerships where it requires both to cooperate, and C, purely private sector investments where the government needs to get out of the way in regards to infrastructure in cargo, rail, ports, airports, roads, water, pipelines, renewable, including solar, wind, and gas energy, aviation, telecommunications, including issuing spectrum. For these public-private partnerships, we will know if there's progress if and when we see requests for proposals being issued. Until then, I'm afraid it is all just talk. Thirdly, investing in e-government technology. This is the wave of the future, and given the administrative failures of the state and the prohibitive cost and poor returns from rising public sector wages relative to the quality of service, e-government is a practical way to qualitatively modernize public services. Our goal should be to invest in an e-government technology platform for all citizens to use on their mobile devices, so that within 1 decade, all government visa, tax, birth and death certification, immigration, traffic fines, education, health, police, municipal billing, social grant administration, banking, insurance, asset management is all officially recorded and available online using biometric and fingerprint functionality. No person should have to queue for anything, least a script at a public hospital, or your police file at a police station, or your birth certificate at a Home Affairs office. This all should be securely available online. The investment now will save billions later, releasing funds for frontline service delivery in police stations, hospitals, and schools, and be a massive boost to the efficiency and attractiveness of the economy. Fourthly, we need to fix Eskom's balance sheet once and for all. Eskom, still South Africa's biggest systemic risk, makes up 77% of the state's contingent liabilities, with 300 billion of Eskom's debt guaranteed by the government, out of a total 454 billion rand in Eskom debt, which represents 15 times EBITDA, or earnings before interest, tax, depreciation, and amortization. This is a massively over-leveraged balance sheet. Some claim moral hazard as the reason not to bail out Eskom, but the facts are, since 2008, Eskom has received 133 billion from government, and in the next 3 years, another 112 billion in bailouts has already been budgeted. So it is time for the government to bite the bullet. Rather than sinking this combined 245 billion into a hole, it should resolve Eskom's capital structure by moving, I suggest, all Eskom guaranteed debt, government guaranteed debt, to the government balance sheet on negotiated and enhanced terms with bondholders, thereby capturing the benefit at least of the over 1% annual credit spread saving, equivalent currently to the 3.5 billion per annum mentioned earlier, between government and Eskom's cost of borrowing. Such a move is credit neutral for the sovereign, as the credit rating agencies have already written up the contingent liabilities into their sovereign debt models. This would leave around 154 billion of debt in Eskom, or around 5 times EBITDA, which is at the high end of international norms. Ideally, therefore, one would persuade debt holders, such as the PIC, but perhaps not exclusively, to swap 60 billion rand of debt for equity, leaving Eskom with only 90 billion rand, or 3 times net debt to EBITDA, a capital structure with which it can stand on its own, never go back to government, and which will support an attractive refinancing of the remaining 90 billion. As quid pro quo, government should, I argue, simultaneously negotiate lower cost coal supply contracts and a lower wage agreement with Eskom workers to put Eskom's cost structure on a sounder footing, lest we find in future that they come back for more. Such a comprehensive solution will immediately be credit positive, not only for Eskom, but also the country, and should see markets rally on a compelling resolution, saving us interest costs, and in my view, lead to a low cost of capital for both, as it resolves overwhelmingly the largest single SOE exposure government has. Most importantly, it will set Eskom free to concentrate on its core function of providing low-cost, secure and reliable energy as an important part of the overall energy supply mix. Fifthly, review and evaluate the package of industrial incentives and the institutional architecture driving South Africa's support for industry, manufacturing and mining. In the next decade, South Africa needs to ask itself, how do we create 5 million jobs? Twice the job creation rate of the last decade, in order to bring the formal unemployment rate at least to below 20%, so from 30% currently to below 20%, if not lower. One example is by getting rid of the import duties on textiles and yarn. The clothing retail industry believes that whilst it will cost the government around 800 million rand in annual revenue, that this would make local manufacturing commercially viable, and including for underwriting volumes and jobs of all exposed local textile makers, could still create 120,000 new jobs by 2030 and generate 37.5 billion in local purchasing in the 10 years. Separately, the experience of special export zones, SEZs, in other countries, including China, UAE, Malaysia, Indonesia, and here in Africa, in Ethiopia, Morocco, and Kenya, is that well-resourced and targeted SEZs signal to private investors that the country is open for business, even though the investment cycle often takes 1 decade or 2 to pay off in large-scale job creation. Those that work have turned the SEZ islands of competitiveness into whole countries that outcompete. As the world looks to diversify geographical sources of supply, including away from China, we need to review our own attempts at SEZs, such as Kucha. We should explore and target sectors with high payoff potential, such as manufacturing, agriculture, natural gas and services, and target the creation of, yes, our own Silicon Valley, including technology data centers and tech entrepreneurs, and find strategic anchor tenants to drive success. My friends, often the master developers of these SEZs, acting within a bespoke government regulatory and legal framework, are private operators, such as logistics companies. But these can also be entertainment, tourism, and property operators who establish so-called destination SEZs, where people work, live, play, and bring up families. Think Dubai. South Africa, with its blessed climate and natural beauty, is, in my view, ideally positioned for this. Making the Africa Free Trade Agreement work, deliver a functioning export market on the continent of 1.2 billion people, will underpin the market for goods. The package of competitiveness need not be labour concessions, though those may be offered. They may include government subsidies, worker training, tax incentives, infrastructure provision, such as subsidised rentals on property, ports, road and rail. The net overall cost of manufacturing and export to market needs to be attractive and competitive for tenants. Finding the first large anchor tenant and over a decade signing up your first 1,000 tenants are the key milestones to success. International precedent is that the President's office should drive this from a unit in his office to achieve the right outcomes. And lastly, South Africa needs to confront the structural apartheid spatial planning patterns of the past. The human, social, and economic cost of segregated and remote townships and informal settlements is both unacceptable and unaffordable. Releasing land for and densifying integrated human-urban settlements is therefore probably the largest untapped economic and infrastructure opportunity of our time. We need to grab this ambitious plan by the horns and create non-racial densified cities for people to work close to their living areas. And this has the potential to change the landscape of our society. In summary and conclusion, Vice-Chancellor, ladies and gentlemen, now is the time not for timidity. We have the opportunity to take bold steps to unite our country. This time is now to bridge the divides, to wrap our arms around fellow South Africans who are destitute, starving and jobless. This 10-point plan is a comprehensive proposal offered to turn the tide towards economic inclusion and dynamism. Growing our economy by 2.5% in the short term and 5% in the medium and longer term must be our driving goal, with the doubling of the rate of job creation to bring formal unemployment below 20% by 2030. South Africa has huge potential. In 1 decade, our goal should be to talk of an economy that works for all. That means a nation and economy that, irrespective of race, class, gender, or status, protects the vulnerable, aims to provide jobs for all close to decent living environments, that supports local entrepreneurs and industry alike, whilst welcoming and attracting global investors and skills, that roots out tax evasion, corruption, criminal conduct from both the state and the private sector, that provides opportunity and access to technology for everyone, from the youngest age, and that provides world-class infrastructure for businesses and communities, that promises a public service that works, secures a stable currency, ensures decent public education and health services, and provides a safe and secure environment for women, children, and families, and that proudly protects and promotes the constitutional rights of all citizens, a cornerstone right of which is for South Africans to exercise the democratic right to vote for the government of their choice. Indeed, it will not be easy, but we can do it. Vice-Chancellor, I thank you.
Thank you very much, Colin. Wow, very provocative and a lot of questions that came in from the audience. I'm going to start with them. I hope we go for about 30 minutes or so, and members of the audience, I beg for your indulgence because we've got very interesting questions. I'm going to start with one from M. Magagula. And M. Magagula says, South Africa's problems are well documented. Low growth, high unemployment, ineffective governance, etc. The solutions have also been well documented in effective state support for SMEs, infrastructure development, reform labor markets, education, etc. Why is it, therefore, seemingly difficult to implement the solutions? Is it because there is no acknowledgement of the problems? Is it paralysis of South African leaders, particularly the ruling party, due to internal issues? Does it serve the elite to keep the majority poor, uneducated, and unemployed?
Thank you. It's a great question, and obviously bedevils everyone, including, I would expect, the president himself, who asked the question simply of, if, for example, we've been talking about the provision of spectrum, 5G spectrum, to South Africa at lower cost, and everyone has expected and debated this for years. Why is it not happening? And one has to look to two things. One is the nature of the deployment process that takes place in the ruling party, and whether the people that are sitting in the seats are the best that we can deploy as a country for those seats. Secondly, what is the institutional vested interest in not having simple things like online visas or the telecommunication spectrum implemented? And so I think that there's some deep soul searching that is required in South Africa about the nature of the state, the weaknesses that have been brought about by the hollowing out of the state through state capture, but also the lethargy in turning around the implementation and management systems in the state. Having lived in the private sector, I would say that, you know, if you're an executive running one of the big companies, you'd be asking yourself, do you have the right people in the right seats doing the right things? And it's probable that in the departments which are underperforming, there are probably good people sitting there who are not being given the space. So how do you clear the cobwebs, take out the dead wood in these departments and get the departmental processes moving?
Thanks, Colin. I think what you're saying follows on to Warren Thompson's question, because he asks, how can we expect a coherent economic recovery plan to be designed and implemented by a ruling party that appears to be so ideologically divided? I guess it's not so much about the bureaucrats only, or incompetence or competence. Warren talks about the ideological divergence in the ruling party. And how do you deal with that? How do you build this coherent economic recovery?
You know, I said in my speech, I referred to stale ideas and the need to get rid of our ideological baggage. And I think there is a certain amount to which the ruling party, for example, is stuck in old ideological debates. So in my travels around the world, the Chinese example looms large in my experience. And I see what a interventionist state that is effective can achieve. And if you look from the tallest building in Beijing down, and you remember that 40 years before, they had bicycles, very few cars, hardly any buildings, and very little infrastructure. And you ask, how did they get from there to what you see in front of you, the most modern, sophisticated economy with a huge manufacturing base, effectively driven by a state? And one has to ask the question, you know, is it ideologically that a state is incapable of leading an economy? And the answer in China is absolutely no. But the worst kind of interventionist state is a state, a developmental state that doesn't function, because it uses up resources that we can't afford and doesn't deliver services. And unfortunately, from our travels in places like Nigeria, that is what you see. You see a country which is effectively not providing citizens with benefits. And we just don't want to go there. We want to help create a much more capable state. And at the same time, the ANC and the ruling party need to be honest with themselves and look within and ask, do they have the answers? Do they have the people? Or should they reach out to broader sectors of society and take them with them on this journey? So I think it is complicated, complex, and difficult, but it lies at the heart of our difficulties at this point in time.
Mm-hmm. Colin, I'm going to be grabbing questions everywhere. There's someone here, anonymous, who asks the question, wouldn't COVID-19 as a global pandemic provide an opportunity for a new way of measuring progress and doing than resort to solutions based on an economic and fiscal system which, in the view of an increasing number of people worldwide, has failed? Does COVID-19 provide an opportunity for new ways of measuring progress?
I think it does. You know, many analysts, if you read the Financial Times, which is the most important mainstream business journal in the world, fundamental questions are being asked about the nature of the economy. My daughter, for example, struggles with the idea of lowering work for below the minimum wage. And she asked the question, should we not have a global minimum wage standard, a global environmental standard? And these are provocative thoughts from young people, with which I agree. But I ask practically, how long are we going to wait for the world to agree about a global minimum wage? And what do we do in the meantime? So the Financial Times is asking itself critical questions about, so do we create a social welfare net? And what is the role of debt in economies? And there's this great conversation going on about, will, for example, the basic income grant that I've proposed lead to stimulus? And it's clear if you're spending 140 billion on people that have very little, and they are going to spend that on essential items, it is going to stimulate demand. And on the other end of the pipeline, the food, the clothing companies, these will benefit from increased sales. The tax system will benefit from increased corporate tax. And so there is a big and legitimate conversation about the relationship between austerity and fiscal stimulus. And clearly what the IMF is advancing is that fiscal stimulus is required in order to develop and protect people's economies at this point in time, and that austerity has more downside risk in effectively collapsing economies through throttling the oxygen that keeps those economies going through this time. So I just use that as one example to say everything is on the table in the world today. And we have to reimagine the world and question the orthodoxies that have prevailed to date. So I'm not on either side of the orthodoxies or the unconventional, that I think we need to interrogate and have an open mind about them.
Thanks. And Helmut Press asked, and this question was asked by many people. I mean, I just chose the phrasing by Helmut Press, who says, how do you tax the taxi industry? In all of this because you talked about the informal economy and taxi, how do you get onto the taxi industry?
Vice-Chancellor, there's a gentleman by the name of Jobo Mabuza, who's one of my long friends. He used to run Fabcos, and he's now an important business leader and chairman of the various business organizations that we work together. And I mean, it's clear the taxi industry has become a very powerful lobby, a very powerful industry. And in many senses, from what one observes, not an altogether conformist industry. And the question is, how does one manage that industry in such a manner that you give them, the support they need in order to continue their function as a transport service, but at the same time regulate them in a manner that they are acting in the interests of passengers and paying tax and conforming with the laws of the land. So, one of the questions I certainly, got involved in a very heated discussion about the alcohol ban, because I personally have very strong views against the role of alcohol in this COVID environment. And I'm a supporter of the ban. But many people ask the question, well, if you're banning alcohol, how can you have 100% occupancy in taxis? And doesn't that make no sense for the purposes of spreading COVID? And I tend to agree with that view. So the question is, why did the government allow the taxi industry to persuade them that 100% occupancy rate was required in taxis? And it's clear that there's no scientific basis for that to take place, and opening windows is not going to solve the problem. So there's an underlying power play that's going on in the taxi industry that one will need to regulate in some manner.
But then in that context, and Anonymous asked the question, in that context, how do we get buy-in for taxpayers for these changes that you're proposing? I mean, given what you've just described, but also the poor track record of the state on corruption and delivery. I mean, there's people who are loyal to the country paying their taxes. How do we get their buy-in, these changes?
Well, I think if people thought deeply about the value of a basic income grant, not only the moral side, but the investment value to the economy of providing this grants to, either 10 or 30 million people, depending on what one chooses, you will get a sense that there's trade-offs that happen, and obviously there's vested interests. But it's better for wealthy and middle-class people to have security in their homes than have, effectively more income but higher walls around their properties. An unsustainable society that is at war with itself. 50% unemployment, people starving. And, all of us, when we do go out of our homes and go to the shops, see increasing poverty right in front of us on the street corners. And we see it's very evident to people. Now, we don't want that to fester. We want to provide a solution that gets people to resolve their starvation income and get people to work ultimately. And if taking some of that pain in taxes, as I've described, for the wealthy and the middle class is what's required, I think it's a small price to pay. And I understand it'll be controversial. There'll probably be lots of people angry about the ideas because they will feel somehow their vested interests are being threatened for what benefit, and there'll be a conversation. It's healthy, let's have that conversation. But if South Africa in 10 years' time has not resolved this duality of our economy and got rid of the situation where we have this two-speed society with so many doing well and so many more starving and outside the system, it is not a sustainable solution for our children, for future generations, for non-racialism in this country. We have to resolve this problem. And these are practical ways that hopefully I've proposed to do it.
Kanshu asks, you didn't talk about the wealth tax. Will wealth tax result in capital flight? And would wealth tax contribute substantially to the fiscus?
Well, the answer to will it contribute to flight is an unambiguous yes. It will contribute to flight. How much do you raise of a wealth tax? Not very much. And the reality is you have to look at the international benchmarks of tax take in the country. And as I said, I think overall right now there is a ceiling being reached on overall taxes. But I'll leave it to people like Dennis Davis, the tax committee chairman, to comment publicly on these matters. But I think the smart engineering that I'm hopefully proposing here will help avert those more controversial problems of how do you then tax people but lose on the other end, people leaving, immigrating, closing businesses, taking their money offshore, etc. This way, I think there's minimal pain distributed through the system and everybody participating.
Time is running out, so I'm going to keep pushing the questions fast and furious. There's lots of them. But let me go to this one, provocative one from Palile Hotla, who says, Colin, you are asking for a revolution. How do we drive this peacefully?
Pali is a friend of mine. He obviously doesn't believe I'm asking for a revolution, but I'll discuss it with him offline. The truth is, we've been living on the edge my whole lifetime. We were living on the edge of an abyss in my youth when apartheid closed out black people from South Africa and repressed their demands. We cannot repress the demands of the poor now. That is not going to be an answer. So we have to have practical solutions that will help give them hope, take them out of poverty, and grow the economy. We can't do this quickly. There's no quick fix. So, the truth is, doubling the rate of job creation is going to require a massive coordinated partnership between government, business, and labor. But we have no alternative. We have to move in that direction. If Pali is referring to a revolution from the rich, or the middle classes, because we are suggesting some out-of-the-box thinking, I think we can manage it. I think that, it's within the realms of the possible that we can persuade all sectors of society that this is the right way to go. Business as usual is not an option. We know that. We are not on a path that's sustainable.
While I'm pacing through the questions, there's a few people asking about, you're calling for the elimination of the middle class. They're heavily taxed. Don't you think they're heavily taxed? I mean, is this an attempt to eliminate them?
I understand. The two practical ways in which we have, in the proposals, tried to limit the damage to the middle class. So the medical aid benefit, keeping it for those under 300,000 Rand of income, does precisely that. One had an option, for example, to propose eliminating that, but precisely for the reason that it's important to the middle class who have an income less than 300,000 Rand per annum. We opted to suggest retaining that for that income bracket. For the retirement funds, it's hard to, I would be happy to have a conversation with people above 600,000 Rand of income to explain why the savings that we will get are not warranted for that bracket of people. But clearly for those under 600,000 Rand of income, the retirement fund provides an important role and buffer. So we've been quite smart and selective and thoughtful about what we're proposing and what we're not proposing.
Mpoma Khata asks, is it sustainable for government to keep these poorly performing SOEs? How best can they be restructured to make them financially viable? And there's been questions, of course, about the SAA, whilst at the same time you say let's get the informal economy taxed. People are asking what about the SAA, and now there's a question about SOEs. Maybe you should talk about all of them together.
Well, I think I might have achieved a record in that I didn't mention SAA in my speech once, and that is the hot debate in South Africa. But effectively what I'm saying is it's a little bit of a smokescreen around what's really important, the SOEs, because Eskom is so overwhelmingly the elephant in the room. SAA is not unimportant because we've now got living with the contingent liabilities plus the ongoing liquidation or business rescue costs that the finance minister and Minister Gordon have to manage. But I think that will come to a resolution. But hopefully it comes to a resolution in a form that draws a line under the SAA saga and doesn't result in further investment in the future coming back to bite us again, because there's no rational defense for investing these kinds of sums of money into a national airline that flies the middle class and the wealthy around the country. It is important to have an airline in the aviation industry that operates for tourism and for business. But many in the business community that I speak to are very much of the view that one doesn't need a national airline to do it, that there are many private sector operators who will take care of that. So I've wanted to turn the emphasis where I believe it belongs, to Eskom, which is overwhelmingly more important than all other 300 entities put together. So I do think we need to resolve that. More generally speaking, Minister Gordon has a huge task in turning these SOEs around. We've been talking about closing several down, but we haven't seen it happen. I do support seeing many of these SOEs closed down, that there may be a business case for some of them to have private sector partners, a Denel, for example. I personally am not in favor, for example, of retaining the stake that the government has in Telkom. They have a 49% stake in Telkom, and one wonders why that is necessary today. It's got no particular function. But these again may be, semi-ideological discussions. I believe in practical questions. What are we going to do on an opportunity cost basis to invest that money from telecom. If we could invest it in, for example, free internet for SMMEs, I think that's a much better use for the country of that capital that is sitting idle.
There's still more than 100 questions, so keep selecting. Savelo says, you mentioned China as a paragon of effective economic strategy for a welfare interventionist state. Some would argue that the economic triumph of China have been in a large part facilitated by a specific political model, one that de-emphasizes freedoms. Do you think our brand of democracy combined with a highly capitalist policy is compatible with the sort of large-scale change we seek?
It's a great question. It's a question we would debate at Yale University, Vice-Chancellor, because the reality is, what kind of leadership do we need in the world? You know, at Yale, I have discussions, for example, about Rwanda's brand of democracy, which has been very effective in driving economic change, but is seen to be a very centrally driven model with a very strong leader in the center. Ethiopia has turned a corner. You know, Kenya has a different brand, for example, in Africa. But as Africans, we need to ask, what kind of leadership, what kind of society do we need in order to be effective? What do we have? We practically have an extremely strong financial sector, a very strong management cadre in the private sector that can be deployed, but we are not deploying them. And so I think where we have a state that is clearly lacks capacity, and side by side with that state, we have a very strong private sector management group. Can we not have a conversation about how the private sector management excellence can be used to turn around the state? And it's in the interest of the private sector for that to happen, but it's also in the interests of the government and the nation for that to happen. Now, China seems to have got things very buttoned down. I mean, their management of COVID, and I'm invested in a Chinese education online company. Their management of COVID, as I experienced it through those people, was quite phenomenal. And this is where the platform, the technology platform I've been talking about, comes into play, because they can manage the movement of people and the densification of workers in cities and in offices through the technology platform they have on mobile phone devices. So yes, people will say, well, what's the privacy and security implications for individuals? But actually what it's doing is it's providing a very strong leverage from the government to manage the population in a direct way. Some people might not like that, but it's very effective in bringing down the COVID case count in China.
Marie-Laure Brandt asks, government is making some noise about infrastructure-driven fiscal stimulus package. You seem to be arguing for the big, as a citizen's infrastructure investment, that should be the priority. Is that fair?
Well, I don't think it's either one or the other. I think that effectively the big is like a solidarity tax on the country to make sure that we take care of this very important problem. It's not, by the way, going to resolve the problem, but it makes an important contribution to the problem. But we need to, obviously, as I mapped out in the 10-point plan, we need to embark on an infrastructure build as well. And we need to unlock the reasons why government isn't getting on with it. So I don't think these are trade-offs. I think they are complementary. We need to grow the economy. We need to stimulate the economy. We need to get infrastructure working. We don't have the money at the moment to have a massive government program, but we do have very significant savings, and we need to mobilize those savings in the form of public-private partnerships. And we can do it. I am very close to a number of situations, about investing in, for example, gas, investing in ports, investing in telecommunications, and those are waiting to happen. And we just need to unlock the policy incoherence in the state and in these departments standing in the way to make these things happen, and we can get going.
Colin, I want to end with two questions, both of each one of them connecting to either your current work or your past. So one is from Sineme Ntembu, and she says, as the co-chairman of YES, how have you and your colleagues been able to continue to activate economic ecosystems through community hubs with the constraints brought by COVID-19 and the digital divide in South Africa? What are the challenges the YES team has faced in terms of ensuring the hubs are accessible to those who need the resources? And then I want to ask the final question. I want to give them to you, both of them, so that we can close it up. After this, I want to make closing remarks. And this is a bit controversial, but I thought I should throw it to you, and then you can decide. Anonymous says, Mr. Coleman, you were never that forceful when you worked for Goldman Sachs. Why did you not speak? Why did you not speak up when these mistakes were evident? I'm going to ask you to answer those questions, make your closing remarks, and then I will close and thank you.
Thanks so much. Vice-Chancellor, before I get into the questions, firstly, just to thank you, the UCT, for taking this initiative. It's been an absolutely wonderful journey. I have a son who's at first year UCT, and my eldest daughter who left UCT having completed her honours and now at the Royal College of Music in London, and a father who has a doctorate, an honorary doctorate from UCT. So I feel very connected with the university, and I wish you and the community much luck, and hopefully you will evaluate how UCT can champion some of these initiatives. For example, the technology platform idea of providing public services online, which I think is a massive business idea, by the way. Somebody wants to become an Elon Musk one day, grab that by the nettle. On the two questions, the Youth Employment Service, thanks for that. Tash Ismail, the CEO of YES, is extremely passionate about the connection between job creation, meaning putting interns into businesses for experience, and the feedback loops into communities. And so we've created these multi-purpose community hubs. We only have one operating, but we are building 4 others. The one that's operating is in the East Rand, and we're building others in Alex and various places. And we hope to have 100 within 5 years built around the country. And obviously we want to try and get the ramping up of youth internships, but COVID has been extremely disruptive. But for example, Tash created out of the hub a mask business, providing masks to people, and there's been a very big take-up, which has created the question of, what's the interrelationship between youth employment, yes, and businesses, and how can we oil the wheel, so to speak, so that we create more demand, because there's an endless supply of people into the job market, as we know. How do we create the demand for those people on a sustainable basis? On the provocative question of speaking up, I do pride myself that throughout my life, and happy to speak to the questioner, I have spoken up throughout my life. And the way that I found, as in Goldman Sachs, in the period, if you recall, the Marikana tragedy brought a new sort of cloud over South Africa's investment story. And so actually in 2013, in November, we undertook a study called 2 Decades of Freedom. And that 2 decades of freedom was, in a way, celebrating the victories that had taken place, and there were many, between 1994 and 2013. It identified the problems, including this mass unemployment problem, the failure of the state to provide bang for the buck on education and health and various other things, and mapped a road forward for what policy changes needed to take place, and effectively took that to the leadership of the country, which was then under President Zuma. And we presented that to the ANC leadership, you know, warts and all. In other words, the good news, the bad news, and the policy proposals. And that's, I think, what you can do is you can be very honest with people about what's going wrong at the time. And, you know, we were, but that led to a realization by 2016 with the Nenegate saga. And I think Nhlanhla Nene is online with us. And then ultimately with Pravin Gordon, who's also online with us tonight, that we are crossing the Rubicon in a bad way when it became apparent that the President Zuma regime through state capture had gone rogue and was effectively trying to enforce a corrupt agenda on South Africa, including the nuclear deal. And we stood up as the business community and said so. And I will never forget a meeting we had with President Zuma in the Union buildings where we effectively told him that what he was doing was unacceptable and confronted him in person on a number of occasions. So we have spoken up all the way. And obviously, all Democrats have to support the current president because we are not through the state capture regime. We have to still defeat this agenda of corruption. And the way that we defeat it is by growing the economy and proving that this system works. A market economy, a mixed economy with the state leading, but the market providing essentially the heart of the economy is workable, and showing and demonstrating to people the benefits thereof, that a corrupt agenda is not the path to prosperity in South Africa. So I will leave it there and thank you once again.
Thanks very much, Colin. Let me turn to the audience. When I met Colin last year, South Africa was already in a precarious position. Poverty, inequality, unemployment, state capture, the collapse of Eskom were all part of our economic landscape. But today, of course, COVID-19 is also part of that landscape. And the silver lining is that it forces us to do things differently. This virtual VC open lecture is evidence of that. By meeting online, we are including many people from around the world. And tonight, Colin has demonstrated that we can also do the economy differently. Well, some call it a revolution, but it's about doing the economy differently. He has given us a historic overview of our democracy's early years, the effects of the state capture, and our vulnerability to world economic catastrophe. He has also given us options for changing our precarious position. Those options involve both collective responsibility and individual responsibility. We can look to the finance ministry to allocate a basic income grant to poor people, but then it is up to each big recipient to practice their own individual responsibility for that grant. We can look to the Ministry of Trade and Industry to support small and medium enterprises, but it is up to each business owner to pay the taxes that keeps our country running and to hold our government collectively responsible. Our individual sacrifices imply commitment on a national level to increase our safety and security, to improve our infrastructure, and to give all South Africans a chance to pursue their own choices and aspirations. As Colin has said, our goal is not a big state, nor a small state, but it's a smart state that works. And I would add, a smart state that works for all of us, and not one that works only for a few of us. Colin challenges us to embrace change, as uncomfortable as it may be, so that we can steer that change to benefit our society. Of course, COVID-19 has put us in an incredibly uncomfortable place. The limits of our movement on what we can buy, where we can go, are deeply painful for some of us, but our government advises that they're intended to save lives. In a similar vein, Colin calls on us to take new steps that may be uncomfortable, but to save our economy and create new livelihoods for the future. In thinking about our future in this uncertain and rapidly changing world, UCT has already committed to disrupt our old ways of thinking about higher education and how we conduct our work, and to unleash the creative talent and fresh ideas that we can bring into higher education and research, and also in our space, and it will not be comfortable. In that spirit of unleashing a better future, on behalf of UCT, I want to thank you, Colin, for providing specific ways that we can disrupt our old economic model and unleash a better life for all South Africans. You have given us all a lot to think about, and I trust that your ideas will bear good fruit. Thank you also to everyone who attended our virtual audience for taking the time to join us wherever you are in the world. Thank you for joining us, and thank you for posing your questions. It's a pity we didn't have a lot of time to ask all of them, but I hope you grasp from those that we asked. This brings the VC Open Lecture to an end. Thank you so much and good night.